The bitter Montana wind whipped across the train platform, cutting through Winifred Sutton's thin traveling cloak as if it were made of paper rather than wool. February 1878 was proving to be as cruel as the letters had warned, but no written word could have prepared her for this bone-deep, merciless cold. She clutched her small carpetbag tighter, her knuckles white with cold and fear as she watched the train that had delivered her to this remote outpost of civilization disappear into the distance, belching black smoke against the gray winter sky. Winifred's teeth chattered uncontrollably as she scanned the nearly empty platform of Silver Creek Station. The man who had arranged for her passage, the man whose advertisement she had answered 3 months prior, was nowhere to be seen. James Wilson, cattle rancher, age 32, seeking a bride of good character and reasonable disposition. That was all she knew of the man who was supposed to meet her, supposed to marry her, supposed to save her from the destitution that had threatened to consume her after her parents' deaths left her alone in Boston with nothing but debts. The last passenger besides herself hurried away with a waiting relative, leaving Winifred completely alone on the wooden platform. The station master had retreated inside his small office, the door firmly shut against the cold. Winifred considered knocking, asking for help, but pride kept her rooted to the spot. What if Mr. Wilson was merely delayed? What if he arrived to find her gone and took that as a sign of fickleness? She couldn't risk it, not when she had nothing to go back to. So she waited, shivering violently as the temperature continued to drop with the setting sun. Her thin Boston clothes were laughably inadequate for the Montana winter. The wind found every seam of her garments, every exposed inch of skin, and punished her mercilessly for her Eastern naivety. Just as tears of frustration and desperation began to freeze on her cheeks, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the wind. Winifred turned, hope flaring in her chest, only to falter as she realized the approaching rider couldn't be James Wilson. This man was younger, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark hair visible beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and a lean build evident despite the heavy sheepskin coat he wore. The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the wooden platform. His eyes, a startling blue against his wind-reddened face, widened when he saw her standing there alone. "Good Lord, miss," he exclaimed, quickly closing the distance between them. "How long have you been out here?" "About an hour," Winifred managed through chattering teeth. "I'm waiting for Mr. Wilson." Something flickered across the man's face, surprise, followed quickly by what appeared to be anger, though not directed at her. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his heavy coat and swung it around her shoulders in one smooth motion. "James Wilson won't be coming, madam," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm Thomas Keller. I work at the Running W. Wilson's ranch." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "There's been an accident. Mr. Wilson passed away 3 days ago." The world seemed to tilt beneath Winifred's feet. She swayed, light-headed from cold and shock, and Thomas Keller's strong hand steadied her by the shoulders. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you like this," he continued, genuine regret in his voice. "Word only reached town yesterday, and by then it was too late to send a telegram to stop your journey. I came as soon as I heard a bride was expected." Winifred couldn't speak. The coat around her shoulders was warm from Thomas Keller's body, smelling of leather, horses, and pine, but even its substantial weight couldn't stop her trembling now. It wasn't just the cold making her shake, it was the sudden, terrifying realization that she was stranded in an unknown territory with no prospects, no protection, and nowhere to go. "Miss." Thomas's voice broke through her panicked thoughts. "Miss, I don't mean to rush you, but we need to get you someplace warm before you catch your death. I've arranged a room for you at Mrs. Halloway's boarding house. It's the most respectable place in town for a lady. Winifred struggled to form coherent thoughts. I have very little money, Mr. Keller. I spent nearly everything on the train passage. A muscle ticked in Thomas's jaw, but his expression remained gentle. Don't worry about that now. The ranch will cover your expenses while we figure things out. He bent slightly to look directly into her eyes. You're not alone in this, Miss Sutton. Winifred Sutton. Miss Sutton, you're not alone, I promise you that. Something in his steady gaze and the certainty of his words allowed Winifred to draw a deeper breath. She nodded once, clutching the edges of his coat tighter around herself. My bag, she said, gesturing to the carpet bag at her feet. Thomas picked it up, seemingly surprised by its lightness. Is this all you brought? It's all I have, she admitted, too exhausted for pretense. A shadow crossed his face, quickly replaced by determination. Then we'll get you what you need. He gestured to his horse, a tall chestnut gelding waiting patiently nearby. Can you ride, Miss Sutton? When she shook her head, Thomas nodded as if he'd expected as much. That's fine. You'll ride in front of me. It's not far to town. He secured her bag to the saddle, then turned back to her. May I? At her nod, he lifted her easily onto the horse, then mounted behind her in one swift movement. One strong arm wrapped around her waist, holding her securely against him as he took the reins with his free hand. Winifred was too cold and too shocked to feel embarrassed by the intimate position. Instead, she found herself grateful for the additional warmth of his body shielding her from the wind as they rode toward the collection of buildings that made up the town of Silver Creek. I'm truly sorry about Mr. Wilson, Thomas said, his voice close to her ear as they rode. He was a good man. I never met him, Winifred confessed, her voice barely audible over the horse's hoofbeats. We exchanged only 3 letters. Thomas was quiet for a moment. May I ask what brings a lady like yourself all the way from Boston? From Boston to become a mail-order bride in Montana territory. The question wasn't asked with judgment, merely curiosity, but Winifred found herself hesitating nonetheless. Her story was not one she enjoyed telling. Necessity, Mr. Keller, she finally said. My parents died of influenza last fall. The debts they left behind consumed what little we had. It was this or. She trailed off, unwilling to speak aloud the limited options that remained for genteel young women without family or fortune. Thomas didn't press her to finish the sentence. Instead, he merely tightened his arm around her waist briefly. A gesture of understanding and sympathy that nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. Well, Miss Sutton, he said after a moment, Montana may not be what you expected, but it has a way of providing opportunities for those willing to work hard and endure its challenges. Perhaps you'll find something better here than what you left behind. Winifred didn't respond. She couldn't imagine what opportunities might exist for her now that her intended husband was dead. But the alternative, giving in to despair, was unthinkable. So she sat a little straighter in the saddle, borrowing strength from the solid presence behind her, and faced forward as they rode into Silver Creek and toward an uncertain future. Mrs. Halloway's boarding house was a 2-story clapboard structure painted a cheerful yellow, despite the gray surroundings of early winter. Smoke curled invitingly from 2 chimneys, and warm light spilled from the windows onto the freshly swept porch. After the desolation of the train platform, it seemed to Winifred like a beacon of comfort. Thomas helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground, stiff from cold and the unfamiliar posture of riding. He steadied her with a hand under her elbow, then retrieved her bag from the saddle. "Mrs. Halloway is expecting you," he said, guiding her up the steps. "She's a good woman, bit of a talker but kind-hearted. She'll make sure you're comfortable." Before they reached the door, it swung open to reveal a plump, rosy-cheeked woman of about 50, her gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a neat bun. "There you are," she exclaimed, ushering them inside with a wave of her flour-dusted hands. "I was beginning to worry. Poor dear, you must be frozen clean through. Come in, come in, I've got stew on the stove and a fire blazing in the parlor." The warmth of the house enveloped Winifred like an embrace, making her realize just how cold she had been. She swayed slightly on her feet and Mrs. Halloway clucked her tongue in concern. "Thomas Keller, you get this girl into the parlor by that fire this instant while I fetch some hot tea. Land's sakes, she's white as a sheet." Thomas guided Winifred to a comfortable armchair near the crackling fire in the small but tidy parlor. The room was simply furnished but spotlessly clean, with rag rugs on the polished wooden floors and hand-stitched cushions on the furniture. "I should leave you to rest," Thomas said, placing her carpetbag near her feet. "Mrs. Halloway will take good care of you." Panic flickered through Winifred at the thought of being left alone, even in this comfortable place. What happens now, Mr. Keller?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Thomas crouched down to her eye level, his expression serious but kind. "Now you rest and get warm. Tomorrow I'll come back and we can discuss options. The ranch still needs help, and there might be a position for you there if you're willing. Or if you prefer to return east, we'll find a way to make that happen." "I have nothing to go back to," Winifred admitted. Thomas nodded as if he understood completely. "Then we'll focus on moving forward." He stood up as Mrs. Halloway bustled in with a tray bearing a steaming teapot and cups. "I'll return tomorrow morning, Miss Sutton." "You still have my coat," he added with a small smile, nodding to the sheepskin coat she still clutched around her shoulders. "Oh," Winifred moved to remove it, but Thomas shook his head. "Keep it for now. I have another." He nodded respectfully to Mrs. Halloway. "Madam, I'll settle the account before I leave." "Nonsense," the older woman said firmly. "The poor girl's situation is hardly her fault. The room is hers for as long as she needs it. James would have wanted it that way." A look passed between Thomas and Mrs. Halloway that Winifred couldn't quite interpret, something like shared grief mixed with respect. "That's very generous," Thomas said. "But the running W will cover any expenses. It's the right thing to do." Mrs. Halloway softened. "You're a good man, Thomas Keller. Your father would be proud." Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned back to Winifred. "Until tomorrow, Miss Sutton." After he left, Mrs. Halloway poured tea into a delicate china cup and pressed it into Winifred's hands. "Drink up, dear. Nothing warms the insides like a good cup of tea." The first sip spread warmth through Winifred's chest, chasing away some of the lingering chill. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Halloway." The older woman waved away her thanks as she settled herself in a chair opposite. "Now then, I expect you have questions." Thomas isn't one for lengthy explanations, but I imagine you'd like to know what happened to poor James. Winifred nodded. While she hadn't known James Wilson personally, he had been her intended husband, and his death had dramatically altered her future. She felt she deserved to know the circumstances. "It was a terrible accident," Mrs. Halloway began, her expression somber. "James was inspecting a damaged section of fence line high on the North Ridge. There was an early snowstorm, not unusual for this time of year, but fierce nonetheless. They think his horse lost its footing on an icy patch. Both James and the horse went over the edge of a ravine." She paused, taking a sip of her own tea. "One of his ranch hands found him the next morning. There was nothing anyone could have done." "How awful," Winifred murmured, genuinely distressed by the tragic end of a man she would never know. It was, Mrs. Halloway agreed. James was well respected in these parts, built that ranch from nearly nothing after the war. He wasn't one for socializing much, kept to himself mostly, but he was fair in his business dealings and generous when someone was in need. She studied Winifred over the rim of her teacup. "May I ask how you came to be corresponding with him?" Winifred explained about the advertisement she'd answered, the brief exchange of letters, and the circumstances that had driven her to accept a proposal from a stranger halfway across the country. Mrs. Halloway listened without interruption, her kind eyes filled with sympathy. When Winifred finished, the older woman reached across to pat her hand. "Life deals us hard blows sometimes, dear, but you've shown remarkable courage, and perhaps Providence had a hand in bringing you here, even if not for the reason you expected." "I can't imagine what Providence might have in mind," Winifred admitted. "I have no family, very little money, and few practical skills. I was educated to be a gentleman's wife, not to earn my own living. You might be surprised by the opportunities here, Mrs. Halloway said, echoing Thomas's earlier words. "Silver Creek may be small, but it's growing. We've got a new schoolhouse that needs a teacher come spring. The Mercantile always needs help. And despite what happened to James, the Running W is a good place with good people." Before Winifred could respond, Mrs. Halloway stood up briskly. "But that's all for tomorrow. Tonight, you'll have a hot meal, a warm bath, and a proper rest. Everything looks brighter after sleep, my mother always said, and I've found it to be true more often than not." The stew was rich and hearty, the bath luxuriously warm, and the bed in the small but immaculate room upstairs was the most comfortable Winifred had ever slept in. Or perhaps it was simple exhaustion that made it seem so. Either way, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, almost as soon as her head touched the pillow, still wrapped in Thomas Keller's coat despite the warmth of the quilts Mrs. Halloway had piled atop the bed. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through lace curtains and the scent of coffee and bacon wafting up from below. For a moment, Winifred lay disoriented, the events of the previous day flooding back in a rush of memory. She was in Silver Creek, Montana territory. James Wilson was dead. And she had no idea what would happen next. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Halloway's cheerful voice. "Miss Sutton, breakfast is ready whenever you are, dear, and I've laid out some things that might fit you in the washroom across the hall. They belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Helena." "Thank you, Mrs. Halloway. I'll be down shortly," Winifred called back, pushing aside the quilts and shivering slightly as the cool air hit her skin. The clothes Mrs. Halloway had provided were simple but well made. A dark blue woolen dress, somewhat plainer than what Winifred was accustomed to but practical for the climate, warm stockings, and sturdy ankle boots that were only slightly too large. There was even a knitted shawl and a pair of woolen gloves. Winifred dressed quickly, grateful for the proper winter clothing, and made her way downstairs with her hair neatly braided and pinned. Mrs. Halloway beamed at her from the kitchen doorway. "There you are. Come have some breakfast. Thomas arrived a few minutes ago. He's in the dining room." Winifred's stomach fluttered nervously at the mention of Thomas Keller. In the light of day, the events of the previous evening seemed almost dreamlike. She smoothed her borrowed dress and took a steadying breath before following Mrs. Halloway into the dining room. Thomas stood when she entered, his hat already removed and resting on an empty chair. He looked different in daylight, younger perhaps, but no less capable. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean flannel shirt under a wool vest. The shadow of stubble on his jaw suggested he'd shaved that morning, though not too recently. "Miss Sutton, He greeted her with a nod. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, taking the seat Mrs. Halloway indicated at the small dining table. "And thank you again for your assistance yesterday. I've brought your coat." She gestured to the sheepskin coat draped over her arm. Thomas smiled as he sat back down. "Keep it for now. The weather's turning milder today, but you'll need it if you decide to visit the ranch." Mrs. Halloway bustled in with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, along with a pot of coffee. "Eat up, both of you. Nothing good comes of talking business on an empty stomach." The food was delicious, and Winifred realized she was ravenous despite her uncertainty about the future. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Thomas spoke. "I've been thinking about your situation, Miss Sutton," he began, his tone businesslike but not unkind. "The running W is in need of someone to manage the household. James had a housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, but she left last month to care for her ailing sister in Oregon. The position has been vacant since then." Winifred lowered her fork slowly. "You're offering me employment," Thomas nodded. "The job comes with room and board, plus a monthly salary. It would involve overseeing the cooking, cleaning, and general running of the main house. We've got a cook already, old Samuel, but he needs direction. There's mending to be done, supplies to be ordered, that sort of thing." "I see," Winifred said, considering the offer. She had managed her parents' modest household in Boston, but a working ranch would be very different. Still, the alternative was, what? Returning to Boston with even less than she'd left with, taking some other position in Silver Creek if one could be found. Who? Who owns the ranch now that Mr. Wilson has passed? "That's a bit complicated," Thomas admitted, setting down his coffee cup. "James had no children or close relatives that we know of. His lawyer in Helena is looking into it, but for now, I'm running things as ranch foreman. I worked alongside James for 7 years, so I know the operation well. And if an heir is found, then they'll decide whether to keep the ranch or sell it. Either way, you'd be secure in your position for the foreseeable future. No one's going to make changes before spring roundup at the earliest." Winifred considered his words carefully. The position offered security, at least temporarily, and would give her time to consider longer-term options. And if she were honest with herself, the prospect of returning to Boston held little appeal. "Would I be the only woman at the ranch?" she asked, practical concerns asserting themselves. Thomas seemed to appreciate her directness. "Currently, yes. There are 8 ranch hands, including myself, all men, but they bunk in a separate building from the main house. Your reputation would be protected if that's your concern. Mrs. Fletcher lived there for 3 years without incident. And what of my status as Mr. Wilson's intended?" Winifred chose her words carefully, aware of Mrs. Halloway's presence in the adjacent kitchen. "Only a handful of people knew James was expecting a bride," Thomas assured her. "The story in town can simply be that you've been hired as the new housekeeper. Your personal history need not be common knowledge." Winifred took a sip of coffee, buying time to think. The position Thomas described was respectable, if humble compared to what she had expected as a rancher's wife. But it offered immediate security and the chance to establish herself in this new place. "When would you need my decision?" she asked. "There's no rush," Thomas said, surprising her. "You're welcome to take a few days to consider. Perhaps you'd like to visit the ranch first, see the place for yourself before deciding." His consideration touched her. It would have been easy for him to pressure her, given her limited options, but instead he was offering her time and information to make her own choice. "I would appreciate that," she said. "Perhaps today, if that's convenient." Thomas smiled, seeming pleased with her decisiveness. "Today would be fine. I need to return to the ranch this morning. If you're finished with breakfast, we could leave within the hour. Mrs. Halloway appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. If you're taking Miss Sutton to the ranch, Thomas, you'd best stop by the mercantile first. She'll need proper riding clothes if she's going to be living out there. Can't have her bouncing around in front of you on that horse of yours every time she needs to come to town. Winifred felt heat rise to her cheeks at the older woman's forthright manner, but Thomas merely nodded in agreement. You're right, Mrs. Halloway. We'll stop at Foster's before heading out. He turned to Winifred. Would that be acceptable, Miss Sutton? The ranch is about 5 miles from town, and while we have a wagon, horseback is often more practical. That would be fine, Winifred agreed, though the prospect of learning to ride was somewhat daunting. In Boston, she had occasionally ridden in carriages, but never on horseback. Good, that's settled then, Mrs. Halloway said with satisfaction. I'll pack some food for your journey. Can't have the poor girl starving before she even decides whether to take the job. An hour later, Winifred found herself at Foster's Mercantile, being fitted for a split riding skirt, sturdier boots, and a proper winter coat of her own. Thomas insisted on paying for everything, saying it would be deducted from her first month's salary if she took the position. The arrangement made Winifred uncomfortable, but she had little choice. Her remaining funds wouldn't cover even half the cost of the necessary items. Mr. Foster, the proprietor, was a thin, balding man with spectacles perched on his nose and an air of perpetual hurry. Not many ladies in these parts wear riding skirts, he commented as he measured Winifred for alterations. Most make do with regular skirts, dangerous as that is, but this is more sensible, especially at the running W with all those hills. Miss Sutton's comfort and safety are important, Thomas said from where he stood examining a display of tools. The alterations won't take long. My wife can have them done in an hour, Mr. Foster assured him. She's quick with a needle. While they waited for the alterations, Thomas suggested they visit the stable to select a horse for Winifred. If you decide to take the position, you'll need your own mount, he explained as they walked down Silver Creek's Main Street. The ranch has several good saddle horses. You should find one that suits you. The livery stable smelled of hay, leather, and horses not unpleasant, but entirely foreign to Winifred. The stable master, a grizzled older man named Everett Jenkins, listened carefully as Thomas explained the situation. A gentle mount for a beginner, but one with enough spirit to be useful on a working ranch, Thomas concluded. Any suggestions, Ev? The older man scratched his beard thoughtfully. Might have just the one. Mare named Clover. 5 years old, well broke, but not dead-headed. Got her in a trade last month. Thought about keeping her for my granddaughter, but she's set on that pinto of hers. He led them to a stall where a pretty chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face stood watching them curiously. Go on, miss. Let her get your scent. Hesitantly, Winifred approached the stall. The mare stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring as she sniffed Winifred's outstretched hand. That's it, Everett encouraged. She's sizing you up, seeing if you're worth her time. After a moment's inspection, the horse nudged Winifred's palm gently with her velvet muzzle. Despite her nervousness, Winifred found herself smiling at the contact. She likes you, Thomas observed, approval in his voice. Clover's a good name for her, might bring you luck. She seems friendly, Winifred ventured, carefully stroking the mare's neck. Everett nodded. Good-natured, but not a pushover. Responds well to a light hand. She'd suit you, I think. We'll take her, Thomas decided. Saddle her up, would you, Ev? We'll be back in an hour to collect her, after Miss Sutton's riding clothes are ready. As they walked back toward the mercantile, Winifred glanced at Thomas. You seem very certain I'll take the position, Mr. Keller. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Let's just say I'm optimistic, Miss Sutton, and preparing for the possibility." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape as they rode toward the running W. Winifred, now properly attired in her new riding skirt and warm coat, sat astride Clover while Thomas rode beside her on his tall gelding. The mare moved with a smooth, easy gait that helped calm Winifred's initial nervousness about riding. "You're a natural," Thomas observed as they followed the well-worn trail that led away from town. "Most first-time riders are stiffer in the saddle." "I feel far from natural," Winifred admitted, though she was pleased by the compliment. "But Clover is very patient with me. She is that. Still, you've got good instincts. You're moving with her, not fighting her rhythm." They rode in companionable silence for a while, Winifred taking in the rugged beauty of the Montana landscape. Snow-capped mountains dominated the western horizon, their majesty stealing her breath, despite the anxiety that still fluttered in her chest. The valley they traversed was blanketed in snow, but patches of exposed grass and sage revealed the promise of spring that lay dormant beneath winter's cover. "It's beautiful," she said finally, unable to contain her awe. "Different from anything I've known, but beautiful." Thomas glanced at her, seeming to approve of her reaction. "It grows on you. When I first came here after the war, I thought I'd stay a season, maybe two. That was 9 years ago." "You fought in the war?" Winifred asked, realizing how little she knew about this man who was offering her a chance at a new life. Thomas nodded, his expression turning somber. "Union cavalry. Enlisted in '63, just turned 18, fought through to Appomattox." He didn't elaborate further, and something in his tone suggested it wasn't a subject he cared to dwell on. "What about your family? Were they affected by the war?" "My father was too old to fight, but he manufactured boots for the Union Army," Winifred explained. "It made him moderately successful for a time, but after the war, the business declined. He wasn't particularly good with money," she added, feeling disloyal even as she spoke the truth. "Many weren't," Thomas said without judgment. "The war changed everything, how people lived, how they did business. Some adapted, some didn't." The trail crested a small rise, and suddenly the running W spread out before them. Winifred drew Clover to a halt, taking in the sight of what might become her new home. The ranch was nestled in a protected valley, the main house and outbuildings arranged in a rough semicircle. The house itself was larger than Winifred had expected, a 2-story structure built of squared logs with a wide porch across the front. Smoke rose from 2 stone chimneys, suggesting warmth within. To one side stood a substantial barn, corrals, and what appeared to be bunkhouses. On the other side was a smaller cabin, a chicken coop, and various outbuildings whose purposes Winifred couldn't immediately identify. Beyond these structures stretched fenced pastures, currently empty of cattle but speaking to the scale of the operation. "The cattle are in the lower pastures for the winter," Thomas explained, noting the direction of her gaze. "About 500 head. We'll move them to higher ground once the spring grass comes in." "It's bigger than I imagined," Winifred admitted. "James built most of it himself with help from the hands. Started with just that small cabin over there." Thomas pointed to the structure she had noticed. "Used to be his home before he built the main house 3 years ago. Now it's where Samuel, our cook, lives." They urged their horses forward, down the gentle slope toward the ranch. As they approached, a dog, some kind of shepherd mix, bounded out to greet them, barking enthusiastically. Thomas whistled, and the dog immediately calmed, falling into step beside his horse. "That's Ranger," Thomas said. "Best cattle dog in the territory, according to James." A tall, lanky young man emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard. Thomas, didn't expect you back so soon. His curious gaze shifted to Winifred, though he was careful not to stare. Miss Sutton, this is Daniel Harper, one of our hands, Thomas said as they dismounted. Daniel, Miss Winifred Sutton. She's considering taking Mrs. Fletcher's position. Daniel touched his hat respectfully. Madam. That'd be real good news if you did. Samuel's cooking's got worse since Mrs. Fletcher left, if that's possible. Thomas shot the younger man a warning look, but Winifred couldn't help a small smile at the unvarnished honesty. I make no promises about the quality of meals if I take the position, Mr. Harper. My cooking skills are basic at best. Anything would be an improvement, madam, Daniel assured her with a grin that suggested he was only a few years her junior, perhaps 20 to her 23 years. Daniel, take care of the horses, would you? Thomas requested. I'm going to show Miss Sutton the house and introduce her to Samuel. Yes, sir. Daniel took the reins of both horses. Nice to meet you, Miss Sutton. Hope you decide to stay on. As they walked toward the main house, Winifred felt a curious mixture of trepidation and interest. This was not the life she had envisioned when she agreed to become James Wilson's bride. But there was something appealing about the straightforward purpose of the place, the clear roles everyone seemed to play in its operation. The interior of the house was simply furnished but surprisingly comfortable. The main floor consisted of a large kitchen with an adjoining pantry, a dining room that could easily seat a dozen people, a study lined with bookshelves, and a spacious parlor with a massive stone fireplace. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, one of which had clearly been James Wilson's, judging by the personal items still in evidence. This would be your room, Thomas said, showing her the smallest but sunniest of the bedrooms. It held a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, a small writing desk, and a rocking chair near the window that overlooked the mountains to the west. Mrs. Fletcher found it comfortable enough, said she liked watching the sunset from that chair. Winifred could easily imagine herself in that very spot, perhaps with mending or a book in her lap, watching the day's last light fade from the mountain peaks. The thought was surprisingly appealing. They found Samuel in the kitchen, a wiry man of indeterminate age with skin weathered by sun and wind until it resembled well-worn leather. Despite Daniel's comments about his cooking, the kitchen was impeccably clean, speaking to the man's sense of order if not his culinary skills. Samuel, this is Miss Sutton, Thomas introduced them. She's considering taking over Mrs. Fletcher's duties. Samuel eyed her with open assessment, then nodded once. About time. Place needs a woman's touch. Men don't notice when things start fraying at the edges. His gruff manner didn't quite disguise what seemed like genuine relief at her presence. Winifred spent the next hour touring the rest of the property with Thomas, meeting the few hands who weren't out checking on the cattle, and getting a clearer picture of what her duties would entail. By the time they returned to the main house for a cup of coffee before heading back to town, she had made her decision. I'd like to accept the position, Mr. Keller, she said as they sat at the kitchen table, warming their hands on their coffee cups. If you're still offering it. Thomas looked pleased but not surprised. I am. When would you like to start? Is tomorrow too soon? He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face and made him look younger, more approachable. Tomorrow would be fine, Miss Sutton. I'll come to town in the morning with the wagon for you and your things. I have very few things, she reminded him. Then we'll make a list of what you need. The ranch accounts can advance you your first month's salary if necessary. The generosity of the offer and the dignity it afforded her touched Winifred deeply. Thank you, Mr. Keller, not just for the position but for your kindness yesterday and today. I was quite lost when you found me. Something flickered in Thomas's blue eyes, empathy, perhaps, or understanding. Montana has a way of finding people when they're lost, Miss Sutton. It found me after the war when I didn't know where I belonged. Maybe it's found you too." As they rode back to town in the fading light, Winifred found herself thinking that perhaps he was right. Perhaps Montana, or at least the running W, was exactly where she needed to be found. The next morning dawned clear and surprisingly mild for February. Winifred packed her few belongings, said a grateful goodbye to Mrs. Halloway, and was ready when Thomas arrived with the wagon. They stopped at Foster's Mercantile to collect the rest of her new clothing and to purchase a few personal items she would need: toiletries, writing paper, and a warm nightgown. "Is there anything else you require?" Thomas asked as Mr. Foster tallied their purchases. Winifred hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Books, if possible. I brought only one with me, and reading has always been a comfort." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "James had quite a collection in the study. You're welcome to borrow any that interest you. And we can order more from Helena if you have specific titles in mind." By mid-morning they were on their way back to the ranch, the wagon loaded with Winifred's belongings and supplies for the ranch. The journey passed pleasantly, with Thomas pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the area's history and the ranch's operations. Winifred found herself relaxing in his company, his steady presence and straightforward manner inspiring a confidence she hadn't felt since before her parents' deaths. "Spring will be here before you know it," Thomas was saying as they neared the ranch. "That's when things really come to life. The hills turn green almost overnight and wildflowers cover the meadows. It's something to see." "I look forward to it," Winifred replied, realizing she genuinely meant it. The prospect of witnessing the changing seasons in this vast, wild landscape held a strange appeal, despite the uncertainties that still lay ahead. Life at the Running W quickly fell into a rhythm that surprised Winifred with its comfortable familiarity. Her days began early, preparing breakfast alongside Samuel, whose cooking did indeed leave much to be desired, though his biscuits were quite good. Mornings were spent on household tasks: mending, cleaning, making lists of supplies needed from town. After the midday meal, she might take Clover for a ride if the weather permitted, gradually expanding her confidence as a horsewoman under Thomas's occasional guidance. February gave way to March, bringing warmer days interspersed with sudden snowstorms that reminded everyone winter wasn't quite finished with them yet. Winifred learned the rhythms of ranch life, how activity ebbed and flowed with the weather and seasons, how each man had his specific duties, yet was expected to help wherever needed when circumstances demanded it. Thomas, she discovered, was respected by the hands not just for his position as foreman but for his fairness, his willingness to work alongside them at the hardest tasks, and his quiet competence in all aspects of ranching. He was often the first to rise and the last to retire, his dedication to the Running W evident in every decision he made. As for Thomas himself, he remained somewhat of an enigma to Winifred. Unfailingly polite and considerate, he nonetheless maintained a certain reserve. Their conversations, while increasingly comfortable, rarely strayed into personal territory. She knew he had fought in the war, that he had come west afterward seeking something he couldn't find in his native Pennsylvania, but little else about his past or his inner thoughts. Still, she found herself looking forward to their interactions, the quiet conversations over coffee when he came in from evening rounds, his thoughtful questions about her comfort and needs, the occasional shared meal when it was just the two of them at the table, Samuel having retired to his cabin. By late March, Winifred had settled into her role with growing confidence. The house ran smoothly under her direction, and even Samuel had grudgingly acknowledged that her influence had improved meals considerably. She had established friendly relationships with the Hands, who treated her with a mixture of respect and protective consideration that she found touching rather than restrictive. One evening, as a spring rainstorm drummed against the windows, Winifred sat in the parlor, darning socks by lamplight. Most of the Hands were in the bunkhouse, but Thomas had remained in the main house, working on accounts in James Wilson's study. When he appeared in the parlor doorway, ledger in hand, Winifred glanced up with a smile. "Have the numbers cooperated this evening?" she asked, setting aside her mending. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "Not entirely. There are some discrepancies I can't account for. Perhaps I could help," Winifred offered. "I managed my father's household accounts for years." Thomas hesitated only briefly before nodding. "I'd appreciate another pair of eyes. The spring cattle sale is coming up, and I need to know exactly where we stand financially." He spread the ledger on the table between them, and Winifred leaned forward to examine the neat columns of figures. For the next hour they worked together, Winifred asking occasional questions about ranch operations to understand certain expenses, Thomas explaining patiently. "Here," she said finally, pointing to an entry from the previous November. "This payment to Simmons Freight Company. It's entered twice, once here and again the following week." Thomas checked the dates, then nodded slowly. "You're right. That explains part of the discrepancy. James was usually meticulous with the books, but he must have been distracted. Or perhaps ill," Winifred suggested gently. Mrs. Halloway mentioned he hadn't been to town much in the weeks before his accident. Maybe he was unwell. Thomas looked troubled by the thought. He never said anything, but James wasn't one to complain. And now that you mention it, he did seem more tired than usual those last few weeks. They continued through the ledger, finding two more small errors that, when corrected, balanced the accounts. By the time they finished, the rain had stopped, and the house had grown quiet except for the occasional crackle from the fireplace. "Thank you," Thomas said, closing the ledger. "You have a good eye for detail." "I was happy to help," Winifred replied, oddly pleased by his approval. "I've been wanting to be more useful around here. Managing the household doesn't always feel like enough, considering." She trailed off, unsure how to express the nebulous sense of obligation she felt toward the ranch and its people. "Considering what?" Thomas prompted, his blue eyes intent on her face. Winifred clasped her hands in her lap. "Considering that none of this is what any of us expected. Mr. Wilson was planning for a wife, not a housekeeper. You were expecting to continue as foreman under his direction, not to manage everything yourself. It all feels temporary somehow, as if we're all just waiting for something to change." Thomas was silent for a long moment, studying the ledger's worn leather cover. "James's lawyer wrote yesterday," he said finally. "There's a distant cousin in St. Louis who stands to inherit. He'll be coming to inspect the property next month." The news, while not unexpected, still landed like a stone in Winifred's stomach. "I see. You think he'll want to sell?" "Most likely. He's a businessman with no experience in ranching. The running W would be worth a considerable sum to the right buyer." "And what will you do if he sells?" Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I've been saving to buy my own place someday. Not as big as this, but enough to build something worthwhile. I might look for land further north, near the Judith Basin." The thought of Thomas leaving, of everyone dispersing from the running W, caused an unexpected pang in Winifred's chest. "I see," she said again, unable to articulate the sudden sense of loss the conversation had evoked. Thomas must have read something in her expression, for his tone softened. You've made a place for yourself here, Winifred. Whatever happens with the ranch, you won't be left adrift again. I promise you that." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it, combined with the sincerity of his promise, brought a warmth to her cheeks. "Thank you, Thomas." The moment stretched between them, weighted with something unnamed but increasingly difficult to ignore. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat and stood. "It's getting late. Thank you again for your help with the accounts. You're welcome. Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Winifred." After he left, Winifred remained in the parlor, staring into the dying fire. The prospect of change hung over the ranch now, making her acutely aware of how attached she had become to this place, and its people, one person in particular. Whatever happened when James Wilson's cousin arrived, Winifred knew with sudden clarity that her feelings for Thomas Keller had grown far beyond simple gratitude or friendly regard. The knowledge left her both exhilarated and terrified. For what future could there be for such feelings, when everything around them was built on shifting sand? April brought a riot of green to the hills surrounding the running W, just as Thomas had predicted. The cattle were moved to higher pastures, the vegetable garden behind the main house was tilled and planted, and preparations began for the spring roundup that would bring neighboring ranchers together to sort and brand new calves. Through it all, Winifred found herself watching Thomas with new awareness. She noticed things she had previously overlooked: the way sunlight caught the auburn highlights in his dark hair, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the quiet competence in his hands as he worked with horses or repaired equipment. She cataloged these observations privately, never letting her changed perspective show in their daily interactions. For his part, Thomas seemed more attentive as well, finding reasons to check on her throughout the day, bringing her wildflowers he discovered while riding the range, seeking her opinion on ranch matters that technically fell outside her responsibilities. If the hands noticed the subtle shift in dynamic between their foreman and housekeeper, they were discreet enough not to comment openly, though Winifred occasionally caught knowing glances exchanged when Thomas held her gaze a moment too long, or she laughed too readily at something he said. The arrival of Edgar Wilson, James's cousin and heir, was preceded by a flurry of activity as Winifred ensured the main house was impeccable and planned special meals for the duration of his stay. Thomas spent long hours updating the ranch records and preparing a comprehensive report on the running W-TKS operations and finances. "You think he'll like it here?" Winifred asked the evening before Edgar's arrival as she and Thomas sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas's expression was contemplative. "I think he'll see its value. Whether he'll appreciate it the way James did is another matter." The following afternoon, Thomas rode to town to meet the stage from Helena, returning several hours later with their guest. Edgar Wilson proved to be a surprise, not the middle-aged businessman they had expected, but a young man no more than 30, with the same blue eyes as his deceased cousin but a leaner build and city-bred manners. "Miss Sutton," he greeted Winifred with a respectful bow when Thomas introduced them. "My cousin's letters mentioned he had arranged for a bride shortly before his unfortunate accident. I must say, finding you here in the capacity of housekeeper is unexpected." Winifred felt heat rise to her cheeks, aware of Thomas's sudden stillness beside her. "Mr. Wilson was a stranger to me, sir. I never had the opportunity to meet him before his passing. Mr. Keller kindly offered me employment when I found myself stranded." Edgar studied her thoughtfully. "A fortunate arrangement for all concerned, it seems. The place is remarkably well kept." "Miss Sutton has been an invaluable addition to the ranch," Thomas said, his tone neutral but his eyes watchful as they rested on Edgar. "Perhaps you'd like to see the house before dinner." Over the next 3 days, Edgar Wilson toured every aspect of the Running W, asking perceptive questions about operations, finances, and future prospects. He was unfailingly polite but reserved, revealing little about his own thoughts or intentions regarding the property. By the third evening, the tension of uncertainty had everyone on edge, particularly Thomas, who grew increasingly quiet as Edgar's inspection neared its conclusion. After dinner on the third night, Edgar asked Thomas and Winifred to join him in the study. The moment they had been anticipating had clearly arrived, and Winifred found herself standing perhaps closer to Thomas than propriety strictly allowed, drawing strength from his solid presence. Edgar settled behind the desk that had once been his cousin's, his expression serious. "I want to thank you both for your hospitality and openness during my visit. It's given me a much clearer picture of the Running W than I could have gained from reports alone." "You're welcome," Thomas replied evenly. "Have you reached a decision about the ranch's future?" "I have." Edgar leaned back in his chair. "Contrary to what you might expect, I don't intend to sell." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Thomas responded. "May I ask why? You've made it clear you have no experience in ranching." "That's precisely why," Edgar said. "I've spent my life in my father's import business, following a path laid out for me since childhood. James chose a different way. He built something of his own, something real and substantial. His letters over the years, few as they were, always contained a pride I've never felt in my own accomplishments." He paused, glancing out the window at the darkening landscape. "When I learned I'd inherited the Running W, my first thought was indeed to sell it. But being here, seeing what James created, I find I'm reluctant to let it go. I'd like to try my hand at ranching to see if I might find the satisfaction in it that my cousin did." Winifred glanced at Thomas, trying to gauge his reaction. His expression revealed little, but she knew him well enough now to recognize the tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. "What about the current staff?" Thomas asked. "Do you intend to make changes?" Edgar turned his attention back to them. "I would hope that you, especially, would stay on, Mr. Keller. Your knowledge of the ranch is irreplaceable. As for the rest of the hands, I see no reason for changes unless they wish to leave. And Miss Sutton?" Thomas's voice held a note of challenge. Edgar smiled slightly. "Miss Sutton's position is secure for as long as she wishes to remain. In fact, I would hope to persuade her to take on additional responsibilities in managing the household accounts, given her evident skill with figures." Relief washed through Winifred, though it was tempered by the realization that this meant Thomas's plans for his own ranch would be delayed indefinitely. She watched his face carefully, trying to read what this development meant to him. "When do you plan to take up residence?" Thomas asked. "I need to return to St. Louis to settle my affairs there," Edgar replied. "I could be back by early June. In the meantime, I would ask that you continue managing the ranch as you have been." He hesitated, then added, "I know this isn't what you expected, Mr. Keller. I understand you may have had hopes of purchasing the Running W yourself someday." Thomas's surprise was evident. "James told you that. He mentioned in his letters that you were saving to buy your own place. He thought highly of your ambition." Edgar leaned forward. "I'm not proposing to step in and take over operations immediately. I have a great deal to learn, and I'll be relying heavily on your expertise. In time, if ranching suits me, perhaps we might discuss a partnership rather than a strictly employer-employee relationship." The offer clearly caught Thomas off guard. "That's generous. It's practical," Edgar countered. "I have capital but no experience. You have experience but lack capital. Together, we might build something even more substantial than what James created. The conversation continued for some time, with Edgar outlining his preliminary thoughts on the ranch's future, and Thomas offering measured responses. Throughout, Winifred remained silent, observing the negotiation of what was essentially the next chapter of her life as well, though neither man seemed fully aware of how deeply their decisions would affect her. Later that night, unable to sleep, Winifred slipped downstairs for a cup of tea. She was surprised to find Thomas in the kitchen, staring into a cup of coffee that had likely gone cold. "Thomas," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, his expression clearing somewhat when he saw her. "Winifred, can't sleep," she shook her head, moving to put the kettle on. "Too many thoughts. You?" "Same." He watched as she prepared her tea, his eyes troubled. "What do you think of Edgar's plans?" Winifred considered her answer carefully. "I think he's sincere in his desire to try ranching. Whether he has the temperament for it remains to be seen. And his offer of a potential partnership. It seems reasonable, given your knowledge and his capital." She sat across from him, cradling her teacup. "The question is whether it's what you want." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. "I've spent years picturing my own place, building it from nothing the way James did. Working with a partner wasn't part of that vision." "Plans change," Winifred said gently, "sometimes for the better, and sometimes not." He met her gaze directly. "What about you, Winifred? Is staying on as housekeeper at the Running W what you want?" The question caught her off guard. I haven't really considered alternatives. This place has become home in a way I didn't expect. Because of the ranch itself, or the people." There was something in his tone, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Winifred's heart quickened. "Both, I suppose, but mostly the people. One person in particular." The admission hung between them, neither quite brave enough to be more explicit. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice low. "If I were to leave to pursue my original plan of buying my own place, would you consider coming with me?" "In what capacity?" Winifred asked, needing clarity despite the impropriety of the conversation. Thomas's gaze never wavered. "As my wife, if you'd have me." The directness of the proposal, for that's what it was, despite the hypothetical framing, took Winifred's breath away. "Thomas, are you? Is this?" "I'm not expressing myself well," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "What I'm trying to say is that my feelings for you have grown far beyond what's appropriate for a foreman toward his housekeeper. I've tried to keep them in check, given the uncertainty of our situations, but Edgar's arrival forces me to consider my future more concretely. And I find I can't imagine that future without you in it." Tears pricked at Winifred's eyes, unexpected but welcome. "I can't imagine my future without you either," she admitted softly. "These past months, you've become essential to me, Thomas." His fingers tightened around hers. "Then whatever decision I make about Edgar's offer, we make it together." "Together," she agreed, the word a promise. Thomas stood and drew her to her feet, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "I should wait, do this properly with a ring and your favorite flowers." "I don't need those things," Winifred whispered. "Just you." When his lips met hers, it was like coming home, a sensation of rightness so profound it brought fresh tears to her eyes. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. Years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of shared affection finally acknowledged. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "We should wait to announce anything until Edgar returns and we've settled the matter of the ranch," he suggested. "But I'd like your permission to speak with Reverend Jenkins when I'm in town tomorrow, to make inquiries about what would be needed for a wedding later this summer." Winifred's heart swelled with happiness. You have my permission, and my heart, Thomas Keller. It's been yours since you found me shivering on that platform and covered me with your coat. I think mine has been yours since that same moment, he confessed. I just didn't recognize it then. They stayed in the kitchen a while longer, making tentative plans, sharing hopes, and occasionally interrupting their conversation with kisses that grew increasingly confident. When they finally parted to return to their respective rooms, it was with the shared understanding that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not as foreman and housekeeper, but as partners in every sense of the word. The following week passed in a blur of activity as Edgar Wilson prepared to return to St. Louis, leaving Thomas with detailed instructions and authority to manage the ranch in his absence. Winifred and Thomas maintained a professional demeanor in public, though private moments were increasingly filled with stolen kisses and whispered plans for their future. On Edgar's last evening at the Running W, after a farewell dinner with all the hands present, he asked Thomas and Winifred to join him for a final conversation in the study. When they were seated, he regarded them with a knowing smile that suggested he'd observed more than they realized. "Before I leave, there's one matter I'd like to address," he began. "I couldn't help noticing a certain change in your interactions over the past week." Winifred felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Thomas met Edgar's gaze steadily. "We had intended to wait until your return to discuss personal matters," he said. Edgar waved a hand dismissively. "No need to be formal. I suspected there might be feelings between you even before I arrived, based on James's last letter." At their surprised expressions, he continued, "My cousin mentioned his new foreman had taken it upon himself to meet his prospective bride when she arrived, despite James's accident making the arrangement moot. He seemed to find that interesting. Mr. Wilson knew about Miss Sutton's arrival." Thomas asked, clearly startled. "Of course. He wrote to me the day before his accident, mentioning that his bride-to-be was due to arrive the following week. He expressed concern about how to handle the situation should she have already departed Boston when news of his death reached there." Edgar's expression softened. James was a considerate man despite his solitary nature. Winifred felt a pang of sadness for the man she had never met. "I wish I had known him," she said quietly. "As do I, better than I did," Edgar agreed, "but that's not why I brought you here. I wanted to say that I have no objections to a match between you. In fact, I would consider it advantageous for the ranch to have its foreman and housekeeper bound by more than employment." Thomas's posture relaxed slightly. "Thank you. We had hoped you would feel that way. Furthermore," Edgar continued, "I'd like to make my partnership offer more concrete. When I return in June, I propose we formalize an arrangement whereby you, Thomas, receive a 20% ownership stake in the Running W immediately, with the opportunity to increase that stake over time through reinvestment of profits. The main house would remain your residence, with appropriate private quarters for myself when I'm in attendance." The generosity of the offer was startling. "That's extremely generous," Thomas said carefully. Edgar shrugged. "It's good business. You know this land, these cattle, these men. I need your commitment to make this venture succeed, and I recognize that a man building a future with a wife requires more than a foreman's salary." His gaze shifted to include Winifred. "The same applies to you, Miss Sutton. Your position would be elevated to that of ranch manager's wife, with all the respect and authority that entails, plus whatever specific duties we agree upon regarding household management." Winifred exchanged a glance with Thomas, reading in his eyes the same cautious hope she felt. "We appreciate your thoughtfulness, Mr. Wilson," she said. "Edgar, please. If we're to be partners in this enterprise, formality seems unnecessary." He stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Think about it while I'm gone. We can finalize details when I return. In the meantime." He smiled again, more warmly this time. "Congratulations on your engagement, however unofficial it may be at present." After Edgar's departure the next morning, life at the Running W settled into a new rhythm. With Thomas's increased authority came new responsibilities, keeping him busier than ever as spring roundup approached. Yet he always found time for Winifred, whether it was sharing coffee at dawn before the day's work began or taking evening rides together when weather permitted. They decided to wait until Edgar's return before making their engagement official, though Thomas had indeed spoken with Reverend Jenkins and had begun setting aside money for a proper ring. Still, it was increasingly difficult to hide their changed relationship from the ranch hands, particularly Daniel, whose observant nature and friendship with Thomas made him more perceptive than most. "So, when's the wedding?" Daniel asked Thomas one afternoon in late April as they repaired a section of corral fence together. His tone was casual, but his eyes held a knowing glint. Thomas nearly dropped the hammer he was holding. "What makes you think there's going to be a wedding?" Daniel snorted. "Besides the way you look at her when you think nobody's watching. Or how she always seems to know exactly when you're coming back from the range. Or maybe it's how you suddenly started keeping that old pocket watch polished and checking it regular-like, as if you're counting the minutes till you see her again." Heat crept up Thomas's neck. "That obvious, huh, to anyone with eyes?" Daniel grinned, handing Thomas another nail. "The men have a pool going. Most are betting on a June wedding, but Jackson's holding out for May." "You're all going to lose your money," Thomas muttered, though without real annoyance. "We're waiting until Edgar returns, probably late June or early July." Daniel's eyebrows shot up. "So there is a wedding. Wait till I tell the boys." "Daniel," Thomas warned, but he couldn't suppress a smile. "Keep it quiet, would you? We wanted to wait for the official announcement." "Your secret's safe with me," Daniel promised, then added with a mischievous grin, "for a price." "And what would that be, best man?" The younger man's tone was joking, but there was a hint of genuine hope beneath it. Thomas considered his friend for a moment. Daniel had been one of the first hands he'd hired after becoming foreman, just a skinny kid of 17 looking for honest work. Over the years, he'd proven himself not just a capable cowboy but a loyal friend. "I was planning to ask you anyway," Thomas admitted, "though you might want to reconsider. It'll mean wearing a proper suit and standing still for at least an hour." Daniel's face split into a wide grin. "For you and Miss Sutton, I'd wear a monkey suit and stand still for a whole day." The conversation with Daniel marked a turning point. Though Thomas and Winifred still maintained appropriate behavior in public, they no longer felt the need to hide their feelings from those closest to them. Samuel, when finally told directly, merely grunted that it was about time and immediately began planning an elaborate wedding cake, apparently having hidden talents as a baker that his everyday cooking had never revealed. May brought warmer weather and the spring roundup, a hectic time when neighboring ranches worked together to gather cattle, brand new calves, and prepare for summer grazing. Winifred threw herself into the task of feeding the expanded crew, working alongside Samuel to ensure that the men who came in exhausted after long days in the saddle had plenty of hearty food to sustain them. Thomas often returned to the ranch well after dark, covered in dust and exhausted, but he never failed to seek out Winifred for at least a few moments together before retiring. On one such evening, as they sat on the porch steps watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, he pulled a small box from his pocket. "I know we're waiting for the official announcement," he said, suddenly seeming nervous in a way he rarely did. "But I wanted you to have this now, just between us." Winifred's heart quickened as she took the box and opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a small sapphire flanked by two tiny diamonds set in gold. "Thomas, it's beautiful. It reminded me of the color of the sky when we first met," he explained, taking the ring and sliding it onto her finger. "That clear, deep blue just after sunset. I love it," she whispered, tears of happiness pricking at her eyes. "And I love you, Thomas Keller." "I love you, Winifred Sutton," he replied, drawing her close for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Soon to be Winifred Keller. The name sent a thrill through her. "Say it again," she requested softly. "Winifred Keller," he obliged, his voice warm with affection. "Mrs. Thomas Keller." "It sounds right, doesn't it?" she said, leaning her head against his shoulder, "like it was always meant to be." As they sat together under the vast Montana sky, Winifred reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from the desperate young woman shivering on a train platform to the confident woman who had found not just security but love in this wild, beautiful place. What had begun as a practical arrangement, a mail-order marriage to a stranger, had evolved into something far more meaningful, a partnership based on genuine affection, mutual respect, and shared dreams. When Edgar Wilson returned in early June, he brought with him not only the partnership papers as promised, but also a wedding gift, the deed to a small parcel of land adjoining the running W, with a clear mountain stream running through it and a perfect site for a house. "I thought you might want a home of your own someday," he explained when Thomas and Winifred expressed their astonishment at his generosity. "It will still be part of the ranch operations, but it would be yours outright, a place to raise a family if you choose." The wedding took place on the last Saturday in June, a perfect summer day with wildflowers carpeting the hills and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and pine. The ceremony was held on the ranch, under a canopy of sky blue that matched Winifred's ring. Reverend Jenkins officiated. Daniel stood proudly as best man, in a new suit that clearly made him uncomfortable but which he wore without complaint. And Mrs. Halloway served as Winifred's matron of honor, having become a dear friend in the months since Winifred's arrival in Silver Creek. Nearly everyone from town attended, along with neighboring ranchers and their families. As Winifred walked toward Thomas, wearing a simple but elegant ivory dress ordered from Helena, she caught sight of the train platform in the distance where their story had begun. The symmetry of it, how far they had come from that cold February day, brought tears to her eyes. Thomas, handsome in a new black suit, watched her approach with undisguised adoration. When she reached him, he took her hands in his blue eyes never leaving her face as they spoke their vows. The moment when he slipped the gold band to join her engagement ring was one Winifred knew she would cherish forever, the official beginning of their life together. Though in truth it had begun months ago on a snow-covered platform, with the simple act of kindness from a stranger. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing, abundant food prepared by Samuel, who had indeed revealed himself to be an excellent baker, his wedding cake a marvel of white frosting and fresh berries, and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. As the sun began to set, casting the same golden-pink light that had illuminated their first meeting, Thomas led Winifred away from the festivities to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. "Happy, Mrs. Keller?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist from behind as they watched the colors change on the distant mountains. "Completely," she assured him, leaning back against his chest. "And you, Mr. Keller, more than I ever thought possible." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "When I rode out to meet that train, I had no idea I was riding toward my future. I was just doing what James would have wanted, making sure his bride wasn't left stranded." And instead you found a shivering Boston girl with no idea how to survive in Montana, Winifred said with a small laugh. I found the woman I didn't know I was looking for, Thomas corrected gently. The woman who makes this wild country feel like home in a way it never did before. Winifred turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. I came west seeking security, a chance to start over. I never expected to find love. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never expected, Thomas said, before lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that held all the promise of the years ahead. Years they would spend building a life together on the land they both had come to love. As twilight deepened around them, neither was in any hurry to return to the celebration. They had each other, and they had time, a lifetime, to discover all the unexpected joys that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a cold winter day, when a mail-order bride sat shivering on a platform, until a cowboy covered her with his coat. 5 years later, Winifred Keller stood on the porch of the house that Thomas had built for them on the land Edgar had given as a wedding gift. The structure was modest but solid, with large windows that captured the magnificent views of the mountains and valley below. Behind her, she could hear the laughter of their 3-year-old daughter, Margaret, as she helped her father with evening chores. The running W had prospered under the unusual partnership between Thomas and Edgar. The Eastern businessman had indeed developed a genuine appreciation for ranching, though he split his time between Montana and his business interests in St. Louis. When in residence, he stayed in the main house, but more often than not, Thomas and Winifred managed the ranch operations with increasing autonomy and success. Winifred's role had evolved far beyond that of housekeeper. With Edgar's encouragement, she had taken over the ranch accounts entirely and had developed a system for breeding records that several neighboring ranchers had adopted. Her garden had expanded to provide vegetables not just for the ranch but for sale in town, and her preserved goods won ribbons at the county fair each fall. Thomas appeared from the barn, Margaret riding high on his shoulders, her dark curls so like her father's bouncing with each step. At 4 months, along with their second child, Winifred couldn't help but place a protective hand over her still flat stomach as she watched her husband and daughter approach. "Mama, we fed the chickens," Margaret announced proudly as Thomas swung her down from his shoulders and set her gently on the porch steps. "Did you now? And did you remember to close the coop door?" Winifred asked, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm for every aspect of ranch life. "Papa did it," Margaret assured her seriously. "I watched to make sure." Thomas winked at Winifred over their daughter's head. "She's a strict overseer just like her mother." Margaret skipped inside to wash up for dinner, leaving Thomas and Winifred alone on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Thomas wrapped an arm around his wife's waist, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her stomach. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. "Wonderful," Winifred assured him. "This pregnancy is easier than the first, so far at least." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. So much had changed since that February day on the train platform, yet the most important things had remained constant. Their love for each other, their commitment to building a life together, their growing family. "I had a letter from Edgar today," Thomas said after a while. "He's planning to return by the end of the month, and he's bringing his new wife. Apparently, she's eager to see Montana." Winifred smiled at the news. Edgar's courtship of Abigail Tanner, the daughter of a St. Louis business associate, had been a topic of much interest over the past year. "I'm looking forward to meeting her." From his letters, She sounds like exactly what he needs, someone practical enough to understand his business interests, but adventurous enough to appreciate the ranch. He's a changed man from the city businessman who arrived here 5 years ago, Thomas observed. Just as you're a changed woman from the Boston lady who arrived shivering on that platform. For the better, I hope, Winifred teased. Thomas turned her in his arms, his blue eyes warm with love as they met hers. You were always exactly who you needed to be, he said seriously. But watching you grow into this life, seeing you embrace it with such courage and determination, it's been the privilege of my life, Winifred. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the laugh lines that had deepened over their years together. And watching you become a partner in the ranch you love, a father to our children, that's been mine.